My name is Andrew Suter. I think most of you probably know me. I provide support for Faster Law, and I'll be running the webinar today. So this webinar series will be taking place each week, and we're going to cover all kinds of different topics to kind of help and make sure you're getting the most out of Faster Suite. So keep in mind when you register for a webinar, you can actually register for future webinars as well. So you can either register one at a time as they come up, whichever ones you want to attend, or you can just register for all of them that we have scheduled, and then you can just attend the ones that you want to attend going forward. So each webinar is designed to last about an hour, but some may finish up sooner, depending on how many questions we have, that sort of thing, also depending on the topic. And if you have an idea for a topic, or you want us to talk about something specific in a future webinar, feel free to go ahead and shoot us an email at help@fasterlaw.com, which I just typed onto the screen there if you want to write it down. So I guess one thing I will mention about today's webinar is I'm going to be running our latest beta version of Faster Suite, which is our November 27th version. So you may be on our stable version, which is our June 4th release, or on a previous beta. So some of the things I show you might not look the same, or you might not have access to some of these settings. So if you want to update to the latest version, you can always do that by just going to fasterlaw.com and clicking the download button there. That will install the version that I'm running today. Also, if you don't already have Faster Suite installed and you would like to install a trial, you can start a 7-day trial by also going to that same website, fasterlaw.com, and clicking the download button there. It'll automatically start you a 7-day free trial, and you can take a look at these features and see how you like them. So as you can see on the screen there, if you have any questions while watching the webinar today, you can go ahead and just click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and just type the question into the chat box. I'll answer those questions and any others during the Q&A section at the end of the webinar here. One other thing you can do is, since I have everyone muted, if you'd like a chance to speak, you can always raise your hand. But I would ask that you save questions for the end of the video. So you can go ahead and raise your hand using the button in I believe it's in the participants window on the right-hand side. You can click that raise hand button, and towards the end of the video, I'll just unmute you and you can ask your question or say whatever you need to say. So with all that said, the topic I'll be covering today is 4 tips and tricks to effectively use Faster Time. So as you're probably aware, Faster Time is a passive time tracker that you can use to avoid having to manually track your time. It's an incredibly powerful tool, both for firms that bill hourly and firms that don't bill hourly. So essentially, what I wanted to cover are just some tricks to really effectively use it. So the first tip that I wanted to cover is how to use Faster Time's new minimum and rounding settings. So these are settings that have been added in our beta releases. Again, if you're on our stable version, you might not have these yet. But there's some things that we've added for a couple of reasons. Essentially, the way Faster Time works, if we batch entries together, it can kind of affect the amount of time that we actually bill in Clio. So we added some rounding settings that happen before we save things to Clio. And then the minimum setting is just a way to bill a minimum amount of time for an activity, depending on what we're going to be doing here. As of right now, you should just be seeing my screen just kind of like this. I'll show you in just a moment here how we actually access these settings. I just wanted to kind of cover essentially why we would use those things. So if we look at our Faster Time work report, I've got a bunch of stuff in here. The minimum and time routing settings are going to be important because, let's say for Word documents here, you wanted to always for Word docs bill a minimum of 0.2. We can set up Clio's time rounding settings, and when we save something like this one here for 2 seconds, that'll round in Clio to the nearest 0.1 if we have it set up that way. We would then just go in and actually edit that to display 0.2, which is the amount we would actually bill for. So using Faster Time here in Faster Suite, we can actually set that up automatically. The other setting for time rounding would be for things like when we batch multiple Word documents together. If we were to batch these 2 documents together, we have 2 seconds and 46 seconds. That would actually create a time entry for 48 seconds, which would then in Clio round to 0.1. Whereas if we were to save these separately, it would create 2 separate time entries that would each round to 0.1, and we would have we'd be billing 0.2 for these 2 entries. So for that reason, we added those rounding settings. It'll take care of that and actually round these separately before entering them into Clio. So to take a look at how we access those settings, we'll actually go into Faster Suite on the ribbon at the top of the screen, and then click on the settings wheel here to access our global settings. If you're running the beta version, time tracking should be already selected on the left, and we'll be looking at the Applications tab across the top. So in this window, we can actually edit these settings on a per application basis by clicking the pencil icon next to the application that we're using. So for example, if we wanted to edit the minimum and time rounding settings for Microsoft Word, we just click the pencil icon right here. And this will bring up all of our defaults for Microsoft Word in Faster Time. You'll see right here on the left-hand side, we've got minimum and round to, and this is where we'll set these things. Again, this is customizable per application, which I'll kind of cover a little bit more on why we do that in just a bit. But basically to set this, what we're going to do is we can select the clock here and choose a minimum amount of time for this type of activity in Faster Time. So we're looking at Word docs. If we wanted to bill a minimum of 0.2 for every Word doc we work on, we would just go in here and select 12 minutes. Then for time rounding, if we wanted to round to the nearest 0.1, we're basically just going to set this kind of how we have our time rounding settings in Clio. So if we round to 0.1 in Clio, we'll set it to 6 minutes. If we round to 15 minutes in Clio, then we can set it to 15 minutes. I'm just going to set it to 6 minutes here. So that's how we actually set these settings. Now, anytime that I save a Word doc using Faster Time, which I'll show you this here, I'll save these settings and then hit save and close again. Now, if I save a Word doc using Faster Time, I can hit Save Selection to Clio here, and it will actually be billing 12 minutes as the minimum amount of time that I just set. Even though this activity was 2 seconds, we always bill at least 0.2 for Word docs now. It'll create the time entry in Clio for 12 minutes instead. Now, if we also batch these together, we had covered how previously it would have created the time entry for 48 seconds, which would have rounded in Clio to 0.1. Now, if we batch them together and click Save Selection to Clio, it's actually going to use 24 minutes, basically because these are both less than 0.2, so it's billing 0.2 for each of them. So I apologize, that's actually not a great example of the time rounding. Let's look at, looks like it froze for a second there. Let's actually use this one here, webinar outline and training. So 2 seconds plus 1 hour and 16 minutes. If I were to batch these together before those time rounding settings, it would still bill in Clio 1 hour and 16 minutes, which would then round to the nearest 0.1, which would be 1 hour and 18 minutes. Now, when I batch them together, this one is going to use the minimum of 0.2, and this one is going to round to the nearest 6 minutes, which will be 1 hour and 18 minutes. We should get 1 hour and 30 minutes as the total amount of time here. So that's just kind of an illustration of what these settings do. They're very important if you're going to be batching items together. Round to, I would say, is probably more important than minimum, but minimum is also going to be effective for times where you actually have a minimum time that you want to bill for certain activities. So I guess I don't see any questions on this tip so far, so I'm going to go ahead and just continue. If you do have any questions or you think of anything, again, feel free to type them into the chat box. Now, as far as other things that I wanted to cover here, I also want to show all of the other settings that we can set as defaults. So this would be what we consider tip 2 for the purposes of this webinar. We're going to go back into our settings, time tracking on the left, and applications across the top. And I'm going to go back into Microsoft Word. So we have our minimum and round 2 settings here, but we can also set a bunch of other things as defaults in Faster Time. So pretty much anything in this window is something that we can set to be used as a default. You can type a default description, which if we look at Faster Time, when we select a Word doc and hit Save Selection to Clio, it's just going to give us the title of the Word doc as the description for the time entry. If we want that to change, or let's say, every time we save a Word doc, we're going in here and manually changing it to say, worked on this document, and then give the file name, that's something that we can change in our default settings here. So we can go back to our default settings window, and we can just type in a description here. Now, it's important to note that we can use tokens in this description. And by tokens, what I mean is these things here. We can go back to our normal settings window, click the ellipsis button next to any of our applications here, and see the different tokens that we can use in that description. So we can use a description of the Word doc, which is just the title. Also, the file name will populate the same thing in there. And we can also use the full path here. So if we wanted to use these things, let's say we just wanted to populate the description into our time entry description, you'll see we have the curly brackets there, and then it just says description. So we would go into our pencil icon here, and we can say working on, then we use the description or the token here, working on description, or let's say working on document, colon, and then have the file name, something like that. When we type that in here and hit save and close here, now if we build this time entry here, it'll use that description instead of the one that it populates normally. So we can type in a default for any application that we use, as well as all of these other settings, which I'll kind of run through quickly here. So we'll go back into time tracking applications, and I'm just going to use Microsoft Word again as a example. So we looked at our description. We can also set a default date. Chances are we probably wouldn't want to do this because most of the time we're going to want it to use today's date, or we'd want to, manually select a date. The duration we also probably wouldn't set a default on, but we do have the minimum round 2 settings that we covered. Now on the right-hand side, we also have some more settings that we can use and set our defaults for. Firm user, we can probably just leave that blank for yourself unless you want to always save your time activities as a different user in Clio. You can always select the user here, and it'll just automatically use that user when you create a time entry using Faster Time. We can also set an activity code and a task code. So, if we are always using the same task code for Word documents, we can say, we just use that task code. Maybe it just says like editing Word doc or something like that. We can just set that to always be the default activity code that gets set when we use Faster Time. Same with task codes. And also this billing section here. If we always want everything to be billable instead of using the default from Clio, we could set that here. And the last one here is our rate that we're billing. So we, by default, are going to use the default rate from Clio, but we also have the option to do free and custom hourly rate. So if you wanted to use one of those as the default that happens every time when you use Faster Time, you can do that as well. We do have the ability to select a default matter to save to. Again, that's one of those things that we probably wouldn't set a default for. So those are really all the default settings that we can set for an application. And again, we can set that for different applications. Now I had mentioned I would cover the reason why we split it up that way, and I think this is probably as good a time as ever. Basically, for the time rounding and the minimum settings, those are things that you may want to set for different applications just for the purposes of, let's say, Word documents you would manually bill each on their own time entry. We would probably want to set a rounding setting for Word documents, but you might not necessarily want to set it for things like emails, where emails you probably would want to batch together and bill the actual time, since a lot of them are going to be something like 30 seconds, 2 minutes. You wouldn't want to bill 3 hours for 30 emails or something like that, when the actual time you spent on it is 20 or 30 minutes. So that's why we would configure the rounding settings for one application and maybe not another. If you did always want to use those rounding settings for every application, you would then have to go through and actually set that for every application that you use by clicking the pencil icon next to that application. But again, best practice would probably be to only set it for the applications where you actually want it to be applied. I will also mention that each application is going to have its own different tokens. So for example, Outlook has things like recipient emails, sender email, the subject of the email, that sort of thing, whereas Microsoft Word is just going to have the file name and the file path. So different tokens that we can use in different applications there. All right, I do see there are a couple questions in the chat here. Let's see here. Okay, so the first question is, what is the difference between the save batch buttons and save to Clio in the time entry window here? So save batch is basically going to save everything for this batch here. If we click this save batch, it's going to use the recommended time from this column for everything in this matter here. So it would basically select both of those and then hit the Save Selection to Clio button. If I select both of these and hit Save Selection to Clio, Save Batch will do exactly the same thing. It's mostly for use when we have a bunch of things and we don't want to go in and click each one. So we can just, instead of clicking all 5 of those, click the Save Batch button, and that'll bring up that time entry window for these 5 items. The next question here is working with several Word docs for the same matter, and you want to combine them into one entry with one minimum. How you would do that. So currently there is no way to set a minimum for the batch in faster time. Generally, that would be taken care of probably by the time rounding settings. If we're batching multiple things together and we have them configured to round to like the nearest 0.1, when we batch things together, that will probably exceed the minimum that you would bill for a batch of entries. Generally, the way the feature is designed is to automate things that you would be doing manually. So batching items together and using a manual or a minimum for that batch of items is not something that we would really encounter in a day-to-day workflow without using faster time. So it's not something that we've really emulated. If that's something that you think would be useful, I'll actually go ahead and pass that along to our developers to see if that's something we can add in. But I guess to answer your question, currently there is no way to do it in faster time. But again, the rounding settings and the minimum per document should take care of that. I would say probably the rounding more than the minimum per document, but I would expect that we wouldn't have any issues with that. So there is another question here, the difference between saving the batch using the minimum and the recommended time, and why those figures didn't change when we changed the settings. So I'll answer the second part of that question first. These times here are going to show a couple of different things. The reason they don't change is because we do want to be able to see the exact time that we spent on these things. So once I actually click on these and hit Save Selection to Clio, that's where we can actually see what we're going to be saving into Clio. This view is just going to show us actually the exact time that we spent working on these things. Now, the reason we have 2 columns here, minimum and recommended, track time in different ways. And it has to do, I guess, just with which makes more sense on a per activity basis. Most of the time you'll use recommended, but I will explain the difference here. Minimum is going to track an application anytime it is open, clicked into, and up front on your screen. So if I'm tracking Notepad and I have Notepad open, clicked into, I'm actually typing into it, this is the selected window on my computer, minimum is tracking that. If I click out of this into anything else, regardless of whether we have it set to track with faster time or not, minimum stops tracking. So even though I don't track my faster time work report using faster time, minimum is no longer tracking for that Notepad. That is not the case for recommended. Recommended, the timer will continue tracking until we start another activity that is tracked by faster time. So an example of this would be if I were to click out of this Notepad into another Notepad or a Word doc or something like that, recommended would stop tracking. If we were to click out of this into something like my calculator, something that's not tracked by faster time, recommended is going to continue tracking, assuming that what we're doing in that other application that's not tracked is related to the last thing that we were doing that was tracked. So as an example, we're working on a document, we need to make a calculation, we open up the calculator, we take that calculation, plug it into the document. All of that time technically is spent working on that document, we just weren't clicked into that window the whole time. So recommended tracks all of that time, whereas minimum would have actually stopped while we went to our calculator. So that's the difference between the 2 columns here. And basically clicking the Save Batch button under one or the other will select that time for everything in that matter. So if I click this Save Batch button, it's going to select the recommended time for both of those. If I click this Save Batch button, then it'll select the minimum time for both of those. So it looks like that's all the questions we have currently. So I'm going to go ahead and move into our next tip. So we've covered our minimum minimum and rounding defaults. We've also covered the other defaults that we can set for faster time. And we've covered a little bit of information here in the actual faster time work report. And actually, the minimum and recommended time settings actually is kind of a good lead in to our next tip, which is setting custom applications. So I had explained how minimum and recommended timer, this one will track until we select something else that is actually tracked by faster time. So we can actually mitigate the difference between minimum and recommended by setting all of the applications that we use on our computer as custom applications. That way, when we click out of our notepad into our calculator, if we're tracking our calculator, that'll actually create a separate entry in the faster time work report, and it'll stop both the minimum and recommended timer, and then the calculator will track separately. So the way we add a custom application, I'll actually just use that example of the calculator. We would go to Faster Suite and Settings again to get to our global settings. And again, we're going to be on the Applications tab across the top with time tracking selected on the left. Under Other Applications here, we have a selection here for other processes. So in order to configure a custom application, we'll just go ahead and check the box for other processes and then click the Settings wheel here. I have a couple already in here. I'm going to just delete those out. But basically, this is going to show us, or it gives us rather, a place to type in the things that we want to track with faster time that are not available on the application tab back here. So our example, our calculator, the way we actually add that is to first, we have to start the application on our computer. So I'll just go to Start, type in calculator, and open up my calculator. Now that it's running here, we can actually click this ellipsis button on the right-hand side of this text field here. Oops. And this will show us all of the processes that are running on our computer. It could take just a second to populate, depending on how many things you have running on your computer. There it is. But once it shows up, this again is just a list of everything that we have running on our computer. So since our calculator is running, we can just find calculator in our list, which is right here. And we click the plus button next to that to actually add it to our custom tracked applications. Once we've added it here, we can just hit save, and faster time will now start tracking that custom application. So now when I click into calculator here, let's say I clicked out of a Word doc into here, both minimum and recommended stop tracking for the Word doc and start tracking for the calculator. There are a couple things that I do like to point out with our custom application tracking. Now, all of the things that we see in this window, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Outlook, Adobe Acrobat, all of those things are going to track really, really well using faster time because we've actually hard-coded into faster time exactly how to track those things specifically. Anything that you add under other processes here, it's going to be kind of hit or miss. We've basically just written some blanket code that will cover anything that you run on your computer to be tracked in faster time. So everything you add here will track. Some things are going to track better than others. So for example, our calculator here will be tracked by faster time. However, it is probably going to show up under time entries unassigned in our actual work report here. So let me see if I can find it here. Oh, actually, one moment. I actually have to hit save and close on that window. And I'll bring back my calculator here to actually let it track for a second here. So once we've had it track for a little bit, we should be able to go back, refresh our work report, and find our calculator in this window now. Let's see if I can find it here. I apologize. Give me one moment. I just want to make sure I have this configured correctly. Oh, you know what I might have is, nope, okay. Well, I apologize about this. One thing I'll let you know is I do a lot of testing on my computer to try to break Faster Suite in any way that I can. So occasionally I will run into issues on my computer just because of the kind of quality testing that I do that you wouldn't run into on your computer. So this might be an example of that. or I may just not have left the calculator up long enough for it to show up in this work report. But essentially, this would probably show up under time entries unassigned because faster time really doesn't have any way of knowing what matter this specifically is related to. Depending on the application, some things may also not track exactly how you want. So for example, I use Skype, and if I were to add Skype to my custom applications, and I've actually tried this before, it will track the time that I spend in Skype, but it's not going to break it up into multiple phone calls. Just because of the way Skype runs on our computer, faster time has no way of knowing when Skype starts a call and when it stops a call. So it'll still track Skype, and it'll show in here, how much time you spent using Skype. But again, it's not going to break up the calls and add them to your matter list over here. So again, depending on the application, one thing I've noticed is like PDF viewers, things like that will track really well. So if you use like Nuance or Foxit or something like that, because of the way those applications run, it works really well with the code we've written for custom applications. Those should track really well. So it's kind of just one of those try it out and see how well it tracks kind of things. For things like our calculator and for Skype, since it's not going to track in more than one entry here, generally the best practice for that would be if we make a phone call in Skype, we come in here, bill the time before we make our next phone call. That way it'll start a new time entry for our next phone call. And that's how we can kind of break it up. So we had another question here about what we have to do with a custom application to make it show up in our work report. And this is related to the calculator not showing up here. So the question is, do you actually have to do something with the application or just have it be the focused window? And it is actually just going to be, as long as we're clicked into it, it should start tracking it. We won't have to actually make any calculations or anything like that for it to start tracking, as long as we are clicked into the window. I think this is just a weird glitch with something on my computer. Again, I do a lot of beta testing and quality testing, that sort of thing on my computer. So I have probably a lot of things broken on my computer, and you wouldn't have this problem on your computer if you were to try it out. But to answer the question, yeah, it does just have to be the focus window here. So that kind of covers what I wanted to cover with our custom applications. So we can go ahead and move on now. The last thing that I wanted to cover here, our last tip, is how to keep our work report organized and how to really easily read it and navigate it. So your work report is going to look different than mine. You'll see that I only have 11 entries on the time entries tab that are associated to matters, but I have like 1,200 here under the unassigned tab. If something like this happens to you, which it shouldn't if you're effectively using Faster Mail and Faster Drive to manage your documents and emails. The only reason I have this many here is because I don't file any of my emails. So you'll see that almost all of these are emails that I've responded to and tracked, but I don't file them, so they don't show up over here. If you do end up with a lot of activities here, there are some things that we can do to filter through them, make it easier to read, sort them, that sort of thing, just to help us keep it cleaned up and really, efficiently bill our time at the end of the day when we come to our work report. One example I'll give of when this could get really cluttered is if we are to turn on specific URL tracking as an application here. So by default, Faster Time does not track individual websites that you go to, but we do have the ability to turn that on. And if we do, what it's going to do is create an entry literally for every single URL that you visit. So every time you go to a different page, it's going to create a new entry in Faster Time. Not really that useful if if you're navigating through the internet all day and visiting hundreds of different URLs. So if you do want to track your websites, there are a couple things that we can do. One, and this is actually a brand new feature, is custom URL tracking. So we can add to this list. Let's say we do only the URLs below should be tracked. We can type in things like, let's say I wanted to track only stuff that I do on fasterlaw.com. I could just type in fasterlaw.com right here, and it would only track the URLs there and add those as time entries. Any specific website that you use, like for example, if you use Gmail for your emails, you could type in just the Gmail domain here and have it just track those websites. So that's one way of filtering through our websites. But beyond that, if we want to track all of our internet activity, we're going to have a ton of entries in this window. So the first really useful thing we can do here is basically just use our filters. You'll notice that every column here has a little filter icon at the top. So we can actually filter each of these columns separately. If we only wanted to see, for example, my away timers, I can just click either this one here to filter by this column and just select away. And that will show us just the times that I've stepped away from my computer. Or I could select, only my Microsoft Outlook stuff and only see the stuff I've done in Microsoft Outlook. So this is a way of filtering in this column by the actual application you're using. So I'll set that back to select all. We can also filter by the description. Actually, I'm going to clear that filter instead. The description filter here is another useful way of filtering through URLs and things like that. For description, we can do something like show rows with a value that starts with, and then type in the URL here. So we could do, http www.fasterlaw.com. And that would only show us FasterLaw URLs that show up in this list. That also kind of then brings me into the logic in the filters here at the bottom. So we've got a lot of logic operators here. In this case, I used starts with, but we could also use things like includes, is contained in, is equal to, that sort of thing, is greater than, etc. We also have, some Boolean operators here and or. So we can say it starts with this and also includes, and also includes maybe like pricing or something like that. And that would only show us stuff that we've looked at on our pricing page. So we've got some logic built in to all of our filters here at the bottom. So again, we can filter by any column that we want. We can filter by application, by the description of the activity. We can filter by the date and time. We can filter by how long an activity took, that sort of thing. And another thing that's useful for is, let's say I don't ever want to bill any of these emails. Once I filter something like this, I can just say, I want to see all of my Microsoft Outlook activity. I can then use this delete all button at the top to remove everything that is currently shown by the filter. So when I click delete here and confirm it by hitting yes, it removes all of my Microsoft Outlook stuff. So when I clear the filter, all I have left are the things that were not Microsoft Outlook. So essentially what you can do is use your filters to filter out, let's say, your web URLs that you want to bill, create those time entries in Clio, which will remove them from this list, and then leave that filter up and then hit the delete all button to remove all of the websites that you don't want to bill, and then you can move on to the next application. So using those filters should hopefully make it a little bit easier to navigate through the unassigned time entries here. But again, if you're using FasterMail and FasterDrive effectively, just about everything should show up over here. Now, once we're actually on this screen, there are a couple of other buttons that we can use to manage the entries that show up here. So for example, let's say I didn't want to bill anything for this matter. This is one of our internal matters. We wouldn't actually have a client to bill for these. We can use this delete button next to the save batch button, and that'll delete everything in this group right here. So I can say delete, click yes, it'll just remove that matter from this list. We also have a few things over here like select all, minimum select all recommended that we can use when billing time entries. Actually, this one would be a better example. Let's say we want to use recommended for all of these, but minimum for one of them. If we click Save Batch, it's going to use recommended for all of them. So another option would be to select all, recommended, and then just change that one. So a couple of kind of quick ways to navigate your actual time selections there. Using select all, we also have a delete all and unselect all button under the ellipsis next to each matter over here. You'll also notice that we can collapse and expand each of these matters here if you've never looked at that before. So hopefully those things will help you navigate through this window a little bit more effectively as well. All of those same things, everything we've covered today, applies to expenses as well if you're tracking your printing expenses and scanning expenses, that sort of thing. All right, so that kind of covers all of the filtering options that I wanted to cover here. Again, I hope those tips will help you effectively and accurately track your time using FasterTime. It's going to be a lot faster and easier than manually starting and stopping timers, but there are just a few little quirks and things that we have to learn here to make sure that we are tracking it exactly the way that we want to. So these tips should help you do exactly that, and you should be able to use Faster Time to track just about all of your time if you've got it configured the way that you want it. So again, certainly reach out to us if you have any ideas on future topics, anything that you want to see more information about, that sort of thing. You can always email us again at help@fasterlaw.com. I do want to mention, we do have a promotion going on this week. We had it going on in November. We had it bleed over into this week for Cyber Week. We're actually offering $100 off a Faster Suite purchase if it's purchased, or rather if you schedule and go attend a demo sometime this week. So this is actually a really good time. If you know anyone else that you think this might benefit, you can certainly just pass along that information, let them know we have a promotion. They can get a demo booked before the end of the week, and we can make sure they get $100 off if they do decide to purchase. If they do not decide to purchase as part of that promotion, if they attend the webinar and decide it's not for them, we'll still just send them $50 just for attending the demo. So this is a great time to tell your friends. And I guess the only thing that's left is I definitely appreciate you guys attending today's webinar. Again, this is going to be a weekly thing, so keep track of it in the future, and we'll be covering all kinds of different topics. If you weren't able to join right at the beginning of the meeting, we are going to keep be keeping an archive of our webinars on our website. So keep an eye out for that. Within 24 hours, it's going to be in our help center. I haven't created it yet, so I don't have a URL for it, but it should just be in our help center, probably called Webinar Archive. So you can just search for it there starting within about the next 24 hours. So with that said, make sure to check back next week. We're planning on covering how to get set up for success using Faster Suite. So just kind of going through some of our best practices, how to set things up initially, that sort of thing. So I look forward to talking to you then. Otherwise, I definitely appreciate you guys attending, and I'll see you next week.